Now, for the last 6 or 7 months, I've been really busy putting around 100 hours into Final Fantasy XVI, and I've got to say I've been really impressed. I know that I throw this phrase out there quite a bit, but Final Fantasy is literally my favorite video game franchise, and so I was incredibly excited for the release of 16, and while I didn't beat it nearly as quickly as I wanted to, here we finally are, 100 hours later, and I'm ready to talk about it. Beat the game, played the DLC that's out right now, and without any further ado, guys, let's just go ahead and hop right on in. So I always start my game reviews off talking about the story of the game, and while I'm going to do that here, it's actually really important that I do because the story is kind of the focus of the game, and that's true for most of the Final Fantasy games, but it's really important that we cover that. And so the story follows Clive, who is our protagonist, of course, and it does something kind of unique that I'm not sure a whole lot of other games have done, not that I'm aware of, where over the course of the game, you follow him through three different time periods of his life. So, near the beginning of the game, you play as Clive when he's more of a teenager, and then there's a couple hours, good stretch of the game where you play as him a little bit more grown up, and then I would say probably the last half of the game, maybe 2/3 of the game, you play as Clive fully grown up. And so it's really interesting that you get a story it's a very grand story, right? You have a very sprawling epic, and it also takes place over the course of somebody's lifetime, and so you really get to feel the stakes as the world is impacted by things that go on, but you also see the long-term effects of how those things can play out. And I thought that was really unique, and like I said, it's a very grand story, so it's given a lot of room to breathe, and it doesn't feel like all of this stuff is happening over the course of a week. It's much more drawn out in a good way, um, but like I said, the game focuses on the character Clive and his supporting cast, which we'll go over the characters later, but they do play all an integral role into the overarching story of both the game and the world itself. And really the big focus of the game for the good majority of the time is the politics and the general way that the world is being controlled and dealt with. And I've got to say, I actually really enjoyed that part of the story, when the story puts its focus on the politics and how the different characters play into their roles in it, but also with how these icons play into it, which I will talk about later as well. It's really just handled super well, and I thought it was a really interesting twist on the Final Fantasy kind of lore, and one that I'm honestly surprised was not done sooner based on how well it was taken care of here. Now, the game doesn't always focus on politics. As far as the main story goes, it does take a bit of a shift near the end. And while I do really enjoy the story all the way throughout, I do think I enjoyed the politics more. I'm obviously trying to be vague so I don't spoil anything, right? But around the end of the game, when the story starts to shift in a different focus and ramp up more or less, I actually found myself enjoying it a little bit less, while still being a very enjoyable story on the whole. And really the only nitpick I have is that, yeah, I do feel like there's some out there pieces with the ending of the game, but ultimately I was really happy with the product that was there. But I do want to talk about the characters, because the story is nothing without its amazing cast of characters, and really they are what make the game what it is. So you, of course, have Clive, our protagonist, who is also one of these icons, one of the dominants. And so in the Final Fantasy universe, we've always had these summon characters such as Odin, or Ifrit, or Bahamut, or Leviathan. And this is the kind of focus point of the story for this game for the most part, where these different icons are controlled by dominants. So for example, Clive's brother Joshua is the dominant of the icon Phoenix. And so the whole thing with how that plays into politics is that each nation that rules their section of the world, for example, they come from Rosaria, that is the Phoenix. The dominant Phoenix is the kind of ruler, or in this case, the heir of the area of the world, their nation. And so I thought that was a really interesting take on this thing that's been in Final Fantasy for years. It's make the characters the icons and make the characters that are the icons also political parties against each other. I thought that was a very interesting and very well done idea, truthfully. Um, but of course, the story is driven by these characters. You have Clive, our main protagonist, but you also have Jill, Joshua, Sid, Gav, just a really good, fleshed out group of people that are, on your side, helping you on your mission, or you're helping them on their missions. You also have villains such as Barnabas or Hugo or Benedicta, who are surprisingly well fleshed out for the most part for who they are, and you really get a good grasp on how the world is being handled, especially to the credit of the later game that I was kind of talking about earlier. Once you get an idea of what's going on behind the scenes in the later game and really learn what's going on, you can really start to feel for these villains and realize that, not everybody is as in control as they think they are, and it's really gets you thinking as once the mid to late game starts to roll around. But as much as the story is the kind of focus point of this game, it's very, very, very important to mention the gameplay, which is definitely one of my favorite parts of this game, and I actually didn't realize in the moment how much I liked the gameplay until I tried to play other games after I beat this and realized that I just really, really liked this gameplay to the point where I was constantly comparing other games to it afterwards. For example, I've started replaying Final Fantasy VII Remake in preparation for Rebirth, and as much as I love the gameplay to that game, I constantly found myself comparing it to this and being like, man, I miss 16's gameplay, and so huge props to that. But I think a lot of it comes to how much the depth is to this gameplay. So it's very fast-paced, right? I'm sure you could already tell that from the gameplay you're seeing. It's very fast-paced, it's got a lot of flashiness to it. If you're a fan of like the Devil May Cry games, it's literally the combat designer, so it's very similar. If you're a Bayonetta type fan, like those hack and slash games, this is absolutely that. But it's also really fleshed out, and you also unlock the iconic abilities. So as you defeat these different people throughout the game, and the story progresses, you unlock these different iconic abilities and are able to use them in battle, and so it's really fleshed out. Not to mention your own skill tree. And as the game goes on, the skill tree gets bigger and bigger, and you unlock more and more abilities, and there's so much depth and variety to what you can do that, like I said, I put just under 100 hours in this game, and I know that I'm going to cross that threshold when the second DLC comes out. And it really never felt like the gameplay got stale, because if I got tired of using a certain ability, I would just switch it out for something else. You can respec your character at any given moment if you're not in combat. Be like, you know what? I don't want to use this character's abilities anymore. I'm going to switch them out on the fly, completely re-upgrade my character, and redo my character's abilities so that I can, at any time switch things up. I really loved that, and I think the gameplay to this game is incredible. And I also immediately want to address, there is a big debate amongst the community of if Final Fantasy XVI feels like a Final Fantasy game, because it's so fast-paced and so different, and I absolutely believe the answer is yes. I mean, if you really needed any proof, it's literally called Final Fantasy XVI, so if you want to be salty or upset that it's, feels different than other Final Fantasy games, you feel free to feel how you want to feel. It is a mainline Final Fantasy game, so at the end of the day, you really, you can debate it all you want. There is a definitive answer. But I do feel like the game is truly Final Fantasy. You have Cid, you have Chocobos, you have an amazing story. The gameplay is one of the best in the franchise, in my opinion, and so I get that it's different, but I feel like people, if the people that don't enjoy it because it doesn't feel like Final Fantasy, if they were to be more open-minded, I feel like they would appreciate it a lot more. Likewise, I know a lot of people that have never played Final Fantasy that I got to buy this game and they loved it, so this is absolutely a great jumping on point for the franchise, regardless. But I just wanted to address all of that. And then also one last piece on the gameplay. I think it's absolutely important to mention the boss fights to this game. As fun as the gameplay is, as fun as it is to just play this game is made by its boss fights. And I'm not just talking the icon fights, but that is the big thing. This game literally has some of the best boss fights in any game I've ever played. I would argue that there is, right off the top of my head, 2, maybe 3 boss fights in this game that I'd put in my top 10 boss fights of all time. Right. It is absolutely the driving point of the story is these different icon clashes and the different boss fights along the way, and they do not disappoint when you get there. Like, this game, the boss fights in this game, I cannot say enough good things about them. Not every one of them is perfect. You do have, boss fights that are a bit lesser against, regular enemies that might be upscaled or just, bosses that aren't even bosses by the end of the game sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I mean, more often than not, there's a lot of bosses, and so not all of them have to kind of land 100%, and the ones that do make it so worth it. And then one last thing I wanted to touch on, kind of, I put this in the gameplay category in my notes, but it really could go anywhere. This game has a lot of cinematics. I'm sure you would have noticed that again through this review in the background, but this game has a lot of cutscenes, and while that's not a problem for me by any means, I know some people, it's not for them. And so the story is told in large part through watching it. Whether you're experiencing it in gameplay through boss fights, or for the majority of the time you are watching the story unfold through cutscenes. That is a huge focus of the game, and I love these cinematics, right? You have some really fleshed out cutscenes, some epic sprawling battles with some, big icon fights going on. You also have the more somber moments, though, the character-driven moments that are very necessary for you to feel for the characters like you do by the end of the game. And I really feel like the cutscenes play a huge important role in the story, and it's a very cinematic game with some very, very beautiful graphics visually, which was kind of the segue I was building into with the cinematics in general, is that the graphics are phenomenal in this game, which is really good because it helps make those boss fights feel really cool, and those cinematics feel really cool, and everything just looks really artsy and cool, and yeah, cool is a word that I would use a lot to describe the graphics and designs in this game. But again, it's also important that it's able to hold up. Like, when you have these big sprawling cutscene battles and big sprawling boss battles, the graphics are able to keep up, and I never really experienced any issues with them at any point, and it's just huge testament to the way that the game was made. And yeah, so largely I really don't have anything bad to say about this game. I would argue if it wasn't for Spider-Man 2, I haven't played every game that came out last year. Out of the games I played last year, I'd put Final Fantasy XVI near the top of that list. It's a phenomenal game, and if I had to say anything bad about it, it would just be that the story does kind of suffer from some late game, just kind of, out there, trust me bro moments, but also I suppose there was some pacing issues as well at certain times. But on the whole, I mean, I'm going to go ahead and give Final Fantasy XVI a score of a 9.5 out of 10. I'm not quite comfortable giving it that 10 spot, but oh man, is this one of my favorite games of last year. Maybe debatably as time goes on, I'll be able to say one of my favorite games that I've ever played. It's definitely one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, and I highly recommend, if you have a way to play it, absolutely check it out. We do have that second DLC coming out sometime soon-ish, so hopefully that makes it super worth it. But in the meantime, that'll be all from me for today, guys. Again, 9.5 out of 10. If you've played Final Fantasy XVI, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear what you think. But if you are new here and you haven't already, I would appreciate you subscribing. I try to do game reviews when I beat them, and also other videos that I'm trying to branch out and do as well. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to smash that like button, and hopefully I'll see you guys back in the next video. Bye, everybody.